Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Ask an Expert. If you were with us last week, you know that Kim and Kirsten are here last week, this week, and next week again. We're doing a series around transition and all those pieces that go with it. Last week was about Transition 101, and this time they're going to dig into graduation information and guidance for students eligible for special education. And I know that Kim and Kirsten, that we have both educators and family members on here, and we get a lot of questions around this. And so hopefully today we can get some of those recorded, and it eventually will be put on our website. The person that will be taking care of that has some other duties right now, but these will be done and ready at some point in the near future to be put on our website with the PowerPoint that both Kirsten and Kim have provided. So this afternoon, I know that's who you want to be hearing, not me, but just a reminder, if your question is specific about your child, we ask that you call into Ask Resource Center. If it's a bigger picture, then please put it in the chat that it could benefit the whole group, because if they're not clear on something or you want further clarification, they would like to know. You will get a feedback survey. We ask that you fill that out. We take those very serious, and we do really use your feedback to help guide next steps. So without further ado, Kirsten and Kim, thank you again for returning. And I know this is a very important topic, and there's a lot of interest about graduation information and guidance for students eligible for special education.
I'm Kirsten Lane. Kim Drew is on the screen as well, and she'll be jumping in a bit. We're going to talk about three broad areas around graduation information. And one is just kind of the background. How did we get to this 4333, as it's been called, kind of place with students, for students with disabilities who have IEPs. We're going to get into some specific guidance around this topic of graduation, and then we'll talk about finally some ideas for planning. The background information, this change in graduation requirements that we're talking about today came about as a required part of ESSA, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. Back in the fall of 2018, we kind of put all of this into place. We started hearing about it a little bit before that, but it began with the fall of 2018, which that 9th grade cohort, which would be the class of 2022, which is right now. So the regular high school diploma, the guidance around this is that to earn a regular high school diploma, you must be fully aligned with state required standards, which are at a minimum 4333 plus PE. And that 4333 means 4 years of English, 3 years of math, science, and social studies, and PE. So that's what's required in every, as a minimum for any high school diploma in the state of Iowa. We'll get into some more specifics around that down the road a little bit. This happened last week too. There we go. So some of the specific guidance around this. Local control in Iowa makes implementation of 4333 or the graduation guidance for students with IEPs, makes that a district decision. So in Iowa, each local school district determines their own graduation requirements. So that's why, you know, if you're in district ABC, you might have 4333 as the minimum plus PE, but you might have a world language requirement, or you may have an arts requirement or a vocational kind of requirement. That's up to a district as long as that minimum of 4333 plus PE is met. Along with this guidance around students with IEPs, though, we did establish that districts can create policies and procedures that permit students to achieve 4.333 in a unique kind of way. So we're still got to look at standards. We've still got to look at those minimum requirements, but we can look at it in an individualized way to meet the needs of each student who may have a need, not just necessarily IEP students, but it could be a student who's an English language learner, or it could be a student who has some health impairments that create challenges for them in the education setting, but maybe they don't have an IEP for some reason. So it isn't limited just to students with IEPs, rather it's limited to students with unique needs. If a student is not able to meet that minimum 4.333 or the district requirements connected to 4.333 or to achieving a graduation, a regular diploma, the district may provide a certificate of completion or attendance to those students. If a student with an IEP does receive a certificate of attendance, maybe after 4 years, but still have unmet needs related to transition in their IEP, they can continue on and are still eligible for special education services until the year that they turn 21. Whoops. Am I on the right page there, Kim? Okay. The IEP team's responsibility. So getting in a little bit now to more details around specific guidance. The IEP team's responsibility, beginning in 8th grade then, is to start to talk about and think about what does 4.333 look like for this student. So how are we going to create a pathway to achieving 4.333 and then ultimately that high school diploma for the student with an IEP. We would recommend that we start with that diploma achievement goal right from the get-go. So beginning in 8th grade, we want to look at what might 4.333 look like for each of our students who have an IEP. And how does that district approach the individualization, or how does that district approach the unique pathways to 4.333? We want to make sure that families and educators all know that the communication around progress toward 4.333 needs to happen at least annually, which would ideally happen at that IEP meeting. However, it can happen more often than that. So if you're in a semester-based system, maybe you want updates twice a year. If you're in a trimester-based system, maybe you want updates 3 times a year. But that's up to that IEP team. At a minimum, it needs to happen at least once a year. And then that progress. So how are we going to monitor that progress? So coming up with a system that works for the family, the student, the district, and really meets the needs.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas for planning. So one of the very first things that people need to know is, now we've talked to you about the state requirements, you need to get with your district and find out what your district policy is as far as your son or daughter receiving a diploma, if that is the path that the IEP team chooses. So like Kirsten said, every district can offer some flexibility. They have the ability to make those decisions at the school board level. So they need to make sure, you need to make sure that you find that out. If your son or daughter's teacher isn't exactly sure, then, you know, continue to ask the questions until you have that information that will kind of make sense to you. Once you have that, then you need to take the planning. Think about, what does your son or daughter want to do when they get done with high school? That's their post-secondary expectation. Now, any of us who have raised a teenager, we all know that that can change annually. Oh, shoot, it probably changes daily when you're raising a teenager. But regardless, at least annually, you need to have the conversation about, are my son or daughter's plans leading the planning that we're doing through the public school and through their education to meet 4.333? is that going to lead them to their post-secondary expectation? As an example, if your son or daughter wants to attend a college or university where a foreign language is a component of being accepted to that school, you need to know that when your son or daughter is a freshman, not when they're a senior. So think about the biggest plans you can make. Make that great big goal plan. It'll get whittled down the older that they get. Things, more and more things will become clear, but you always want to be doing the reach for what's the hardest thing that would happen, or what's the most difficult college to get into. You can always back off, but you can't fit 4 years of language into their senior year if the university that they want to attend requires that. So make sure that the planning and the course of study align with your son or daughter's post-secondary expectation. One of the things that can really help with that is the Iowa Transition Model Framework. We talked a little bit about that last week, and we will show you that resource again here at the end. But that allows you and the IEP team and your student to have those high expectations and to make the plan for reaching those. So then you need to think also about accommodations and or modifications that are needed for your son or daughter to reach the graduation requirements. And here's a little, just a little tip or trick. If your kiddo is thinking about going to post-secondary ed, be it a junior college or a 4-year college or university, you need to think about what accommodations are going to be available to them on the college campus, so that you try to mirror that in high school, at least by their junior or senior year. It can take a while for kids to get, maybe they've had quite a few accommodations through middle school, maybe even early in high school, but you don't want a kiddo to have 10 or 15 accommodations on their IEP by the time they're a senior, and then a majority of those not be available for them at the collegiate level, because that's just going to be a huge change for them and something that's going to be really difficult to adjust to. So again, that's a matter of looking as far ahead as you can with what's required at the college or university and trying to step your way to that while your kids are in high school. So the next part is we want to talk about what kind of things can you do as family members. And these are things that I would say, as much as possible, involve your son or daughter in these things, right? So if you were here last week, we talked about self-determination. Students need to be able to, whether they go to college or whether they just go to a job, they need to be able to explain to professors at a school or their boss at a job, this is what my disability looks like for me. This is what I need in order to be successful. And that doesn't matter if it's in a college class or if it's on the job. If I'm easily distracted and I'm going to work, having me sit by the elevator where people are constantly getting on and off is probably not a great thing for me. I'm going to be distracted all day long. It's not that I'm unable to do my job. I'm going to be more successful at doing my job if I'm in a quieter part of the environment. So it's just things like that. It's helping your son or daughter be able to explain what their disability is or what it looks like to them and how they can be successful. So you can really help, and you can start that from the time you have a small child. The transition roadmap, thank you, Mari. That is on the transition roadmap. I think we have that linked again at the end of this slide deck. But that's a great way. Take a look at all of the little things you can do from the time your son or daughter starts school until they graduate. This doesn't all have to happen once they turn 14. Okay, so then the second bullet point here is consider what they want to do after high school. Think about that, prepare for that. I talked a little bit about that on the previous slide. So again, have constant conversations with your son or daughter about that, and know that every student with or without a disability changes their minds umpteen times while they're going through high school. That is not unusual. There are days I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, and I'm considerably older than 18. So don't let that stop the conversation. All right. So we want you to communicate with your IEP team. So we want you annually to be talking about, okay, what are the graduation requirements? What do they have to do? Johnny wants to go to this university. These are the requirements to get in. How are we going to, between freshman year and senior year, how are we going to meet those expectations, as well as getting them a high school diploma, if that's what where you want. So just know that you don't always finish where you start. So there's a lot of broken pathways and a lot of crooked sidewalks along the way. So it's not a problem as long as the communication is going on. So as Kirsten said earlier, we want you to work with the IEP team to identify what your son or daughter might need to meet graduation requirements. And as she said, we would always say, start with a full diploma as the goal. And if you get into the high school career and things just aren't working to that, you can always back off a little bit and say, you know what, this probably isn't going to happen for my son or daughter. So we need to think about a certificate of attendance or completion in those cases. But again, if you start with that thought and then change your mind too late in the game, it may be hard to make up for that. And then we talked about, or I think I mentioned earlier, about maintaining high expectation for your students' progress. Set challenging goals. Talk about the services. Help your son or daughter advocate for themselves. And the easiest place to practice that is in high school, or if they have a high school job, practice those things there so that people can help them out. And then when they get older, it won't be such a foreign concept to them. So all of this is about, we all get better at things when we practice them. And so those things will help your students as well. All right, Kirsten. Okay, so keep in mind, every student's path to graduation may look different. It should be based on their unique needs, their unique goals. It should be constant conversation as part of the IEP team meeting. Where are we at? Where do we want to go? Has the goal for the post-secondary expectation, has that changed? If so, how do we need to adapt our current planning to get there? Work with your IEP team. Kind of talked about that a little bit already. You want to keep informed of the progress. You want to make sure that things are moving along as they should be. We need to keep, we have to remember that special education students, like I said, like all students, have a range of interests and investment in their high school. Some of them are all in and they're really focused and they're really keyed in. Other kids, they don't know what they want to do. So just help them explore, have them talk to your family members, friends of their parents, have them explore different things that they might want to do for a job. All of those things, ask questions, volunteer, have a part-time job when it's an option for them within high school. The more of those experiences they have, the more they will learn about themselves and about the world of work, which will only benefit them in the long run. There's a whole lot of resources that if you get stuck, Kirsten and I are definitely resources you can tap into if you need to. And our contact information is at the very end of the slide deck. There are wonderful resources within each AEA through the Family and Educator Partnership coordinators. And as many of you already know, the people at ASK are also incredibly helpful. as to helping navigate through this process. So we're going to share some additional resources at the very end with live links that you will be able to click right into and see those things. But those, just keep all of those different things in mind.
So all of this information is on educateiowa.gov, which is the DE's website. If you put secondary transition in the search bar, it will take you right to the page that has all kinds of different secondary transition information. But then there is one on graduation changes for students eligible for special education services. Within that section, these are the documents that you'll find. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I did want to just give you a little bit of a peek at what this is going to look like. So these are kind of the, this first document is really just that overview of what is the change. It lines it up with the sections of the code that relate to it and puts in some of the specific details. But then it also goes into implications for districts, policies, and procedures. Much of this is very similar to the content that we just shared with you. But there's probably a little bit more depth to it than what we were able to share during this session. Okay, so now I'm going to bring possibly this slide deck back up. Then there is a section on graduation guidance for IEP teams. And this one looks like this, where it again just provides an overview of the change, but then it talks a little more specifically about implications for IEP teams and districts. And it talks about how districts can establish their own policies, how the IEP team beginning in 8th grade works on developing that pathway and gets into some of the planning kinds of ideas that Kim talked about. There's also a little section here on how discussions to have if you're talking with a student and a family, with teachers and principals, or just regarding district policy in general. And then finally is the information for families. So this is again an overview of the change. So it gives just a general summary of what's different under 4333 and when it goes into effect. And then it talks very specifically about how this might impact students. And then it goes into possible actions for families. And that's, again, there's a lot of similarity to that with what Kim just shared in her planning information. So if you want to take a deeper dive before this gets posted on the Ask Resources website, you can find all of these documents right on the Educate Iowa page. There are also, whoops, gosh darn, there we go. There are also 2 videos on there. This graduation information and guidance video uses the text, the words verbatim from this document, the graduation information document, but it just walks you through it if you're more of an auditory learner rather than someone who gets your information from reading. This provides just I don't know, I think it's about a 9-minute video. Maybe it's a little shorter than that, but just walking through word for word what's on the guidance information for families. And then there is a very in-depth high school graduation requirements video that goes through all of the requirements and all of the details in an extremely detailed kind of way. So if that's something you would be interested in, it is all right there. And I think that might be a couple of hours of just talking through step by step every bit of the guidance.
Kirsten, one of the things, I put this in chat, but I'm not sure that everyone can see it, or if only the gals at Ask who are running the meeting can see. One of the things to note, and we did mention this, that the change in the law affects the freshman class of 2018, which are the kiddos that would reach their 4 years of high school this spring. Keep in mind that once that happened, it also means every class going forward it's not just like this one class, it's everything from now. It will become the standard, and people who have kids who are entering high school now won't know any differently. 4333 will be the requirement. So
Great point. Yes, this is it. So everybody who's in high school right now is impacted by this, unless you are in a 4+ program. So you technically met graduation requirements last year, but have unmet needs related to transition, and you're continuing in a 4+ program right now. This would not apply to you, but anyone else who's in a high school setting would be impacted by this, correct? Okay, some resources. So I am going to share the Iowa transition model briefly with you. If you were here last week, as Kim said earlier, we talked about this a little bit, but there is so much connection with this model and planning for graduation that it just seemed important to bring it up again.
Kristen, can you
Everything.
show that as a single page instead of us seeing the side view, because that will help people.
How am I going to do that, Kim?
I'm not sure.
Oh, here we go.
Well,
So it's 2 pages. So I can show you this much of it right now. And then when you get it, you'll be able to
yes.
see it in up close and personal. But I think the key thing that I want to point out about this, without walking through every step of it, I have no intention of doing that. I think if you need help with or support with or want more information about the Iowa transition model, you can definitely reach out to us or reach out to your AEA, your IEP team to talk about it more. But I think the bottom line and the most important part of this related to graduation is connecting with those post-secondary expectations right here. So when you begin transition planning and that process, every student who is age 14 and older, and some maybe who are younger, has a transition IEP. And when you have a transition IEP, that means that there are some additions. All of the stuff that you had as an elementary student is still in your IEP, but there are some additions to your IEP that help the IEP team really focus on post-secondary outcomes. What are those post-secondary expectations, or you'll hear them called PSEs? What are those PSEs that your student has? And through assessment, solid transition assessment, what do we know that they already can do or already know that are going to help them reach those PSEs? And what do we know based on that assessment to be gaps or things they still need to learn or that they still need support with? And so starting with those PSEs and good solid assessment, you begin to formulate a plan for graduation, a plan for instruction and services and supports that will guide that student closer and closer to their post-secondary expectation. So as Kim was talking about earlier, if you have a student who's planning to go on to post-secondary education, and that post-secondary education requires some kind of world language while you're still in high school, well, that becomes a part of your plan. May not be a part of 4333, but it becomes a part of your plan. The post-secondary expectations are really, I think, the driving force of the whole IEP. So then we begin to look at what skills do they need, what skills do they already have, and then find that discrepancy. This discrepancy right here between what skills they're going to need and what skills they already have really becomes the IEP. If there's instruction that they need, maybe there's a goal. So maybe there are linkages that they need. They're going to need ongoing supports. Maybe there are some kind of services or supports while they're still in high school, a job coach, or some kind of support while they're on a community site, those kinds of things. But we really look at where are they headed and what do they need to get there. And then those discrepancies are addressed through courses, activities, goals, services, and supports. And then we do it all over again every year. It's a cyclical process, even within a year, because as things change, as Kim said, your post-secondary expectation might change on a daily basis. We might not update the IEP daily, but if there are major shifts in that post-secondary expectation or major shifts in skill attainment, you might have an IEP meeting to adjust and adapt where you're headed or how you're going to get there. Maybe either one of those two things might change. So really focusing on this model and the questions and the ideas and the conversation starters that we have in here, I think are really a critical part of graduation planning. So something to keep in mind. And then the decision guides. Kim, I don't remember. Were you going to talk about the decision guides or was I? Okay. This is also on the Educate Iowa under Secondary Transition, decision guides that help us really think about post-secondary expectations and that planning for post-high school. Now, Kim might go into more detail on these next week in the 4+ session, because these were really designed to help us think about when is it time for graduation? Even though there is a rule that says that you're eligible until age 21, that is, if you have not yet graduated and have unmet needs in your IEP. So it's still an IEP team decision. It's not just an automatic, you go till you're 21. That becomes an IEP team decision as to what needs are unmet and can be met best through school programs. And these decision-making guides really help us to think about that, again, based on the post-secondary expectations. So there's all these different things that could be a post-secondary expectation for learning. And these are considerations that you might want to talk about in your IEP meeting and might want to talk about as a family, as far as how to address the steps toward reaching that post-secondary expectation. And then finally, and again, too much detail to go into within this session. As you can see, there are links to all kinds of additional resources and services and programs. So lots of information in here. But then the final page of this is really thinking about how to make that decision about graduation or moving on to 4+ services. And so if the student has all of their academic, social, and behavioral skills and has met their graduation requirements, the recommended decision is they graduate. If they have a gap, there are some options. Maybe they do go ahead and graduate, but we connect them with disability services. That's that linkages thing that I was talking about at the college campus to help address those gaps or those needs they might have. Or maybe they do some 4+ services to work on developing those skills so that they're successful in the post-secondary setting. So again, there's multiple scenarios to really help you think through, okay, this fits kind of where my student is at. So these are the options that we might want to consider. So looking at those decision-making guides on the Educate Iowa website might be helpful. There's a similar one for working that walks through the same kind of format. And then Transition Iowa, which we shared last week as well. But again, if you weren't here last week, we didn't want you to miss out on this resource. This site has been, Mari has spent a ton of time on this site and really has developed it into a user-friendly kind of place to gather information about transition planning, about assessment resources. You'll find the transition guide or the Iowa transition model on here. I think you'll find those decision-making guides on here. There's a lot of shared information. So between here and the Department of Education site, but good resources for you to consider as your family approaches these graduation decisions. We also listed your FEP coordinators within each AEA and Ask Resource Center as other resources that you might want to tap into as you're working through these decisions. I also want to say, and we should have put that at the very top of this page, your IEP team is the first place to go. Always, 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 because I'll get calls sometimes about questions related to graduation. I don't know the district. I don't know the student. I don't know the history. I can talk about the guidance, but the people who know your child, who know your student, and who know the system and the district is the best first place to go. And then if questions arise or you need some help in making decisions, going to these resources next. Here's our contact information. We have about 20 minutes left, and we intentionally left that time because generally there are questions around this topic. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now too.
So Kirsten and Kim, I didn't see any questions come up per se, but the one thing I heard loud and clear is that it's not one size fits all. So that IEP team and you knowing your child and knowing their strengths and what your vision and goal and what their vision and goal is really critical in this process. Not just saying, well, what's the template or what's the way we get through this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know your question isn't directly related to this, but Deb, I'm just going to add something in here. Knowing your child, their post-secondary expectations, where they're at, what the gaps are, that kind of thing that we talked about is critical to this process. But oftentimes a question will come up, well, my student is on the alternate assessment, uses standards from the DLM. And so if my student is on alternate assessment, can they still graduate with a regular diploma? Again, depends on the district, but from the perspective of the Department of Education, absolutely. You would just work with the gen ed provider and the special ed provider of services. So if it's a math goal, or it'd be the math teacher and the special ed teacher working together to develop what does 4333 look like for this student? What do the math standards look like? Because remember that 4333 is 4 years of English, 3 years of language, or I'm so sorry, 4 years of English language arts, 3 years of math, science, and social studies. It does not talk about Carnegie units. It does not talk about seat time. It does not talk about any parameters around that 4 years. So if you have an IEP goal in English language arts, in math, in science, in social studies, if you're receiving direct instruction in those areas throughout the year for 4 years and 3 for the other content areas, if your district allows that as an individualized approach to your 4333, then yes, that student would be able to still earn that regular high school diploma.
So we have had a couple of questions come in. If a student gets all their math instruction in the special ed room, can they get a diploma?
Oh, well, that's exactly the question I was just addressing, because
That's what I thought.
Thank you, Mari. Yes. So yes, as long as the district allows that. So again, that's a district decision. There are some districts that say our district graduation requirements are that you take Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry. That's your 3 years. If there is no leniency in that, and a student can't pass those 3 classes, then that will be a problem. If there is allowance for individualization and unique pathways, then absolutely. A student who receives all of their math instruction, a student who receives all of their instruction or a majority of their instruction in special ed classrooms can still get a diploma.
Okay. I know that you and Kim can see this question in there, and it's about What if your district doesn't know? I ask because my district really only they established their secondary transition 3 years ago. Many times the IEP team, school team does not know. And so this person saying they're unaware of state guidelines or district policies. So what would you recommend if that happens?
Right. So I would recommend starting with your AEA. I would also recommend sharing this website and these resources with your school district so that they can see what the guidance is. But between the AEA and sharing these Department of Ed resources, if there are still questions, then you can certainly give them my name and contact information, and I'd be happy to walk through some of this with them.
Thank you, Kirsten. So we have a question. Can you clarify that 4+ services is an IEP decision from year to year? You don't automatically qualify to go through that 21st year. And so then another person talks about what happens if a school administration decides without input from the parent that our child no longer qualifies for services before age 21. And we as parents feel that our child still has gaps that need to be met. So both of those kind of are,
Sure.
speaking to the same thing.
Sure. So age 21 is, and Kim, help correct me on this as I talk through this or add to it, but age 21 is certainly written that there is entitlement to services through age 21 if you have unmet needs. So those decision-making guides really talk you through some of those, how those unmet needs might look and what your response to those unmet needs might be. There are times when it may be that based on your students' post-secondary expectations and what their plans for the future are and what their skills are, that there aren't needs that need to still be addressed at school. Or there may be needs that still need to be addressed at school, but the student and or the family choose not to continue on. So it does become an IEP team decision to determine where the needs can best be met.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with all of that.
Okay.
The administrators in the building, if a parent does not agree with a decision, then there are dispute resolution options available that could be utilized to talk through that, because it should not be a one person. Just as the parent can't make the decision, my student is definitely going to 4+, the district administration cannot on their own say that's not a choice. So it's an IEP team decision. And if you don't feel that that has happened, again, I would, contact the district and or AEA. And if need be, then the dispute resolution options are available to address that.
So yeah, so call an IEP meeting first, because in the question that you shared, Deb, if the school administration decides without input from parents, that means it didn't happen at an IEP meeting, I'm guessing. And so you would call an IEP meeting first and then go into the dispute resolution process if that IEP meeting you don't come to conclusions that are shared conclusions.
Okay. There was a question about, was there any thought given to making a special education diploma available for those kids that are not able to meet the 4.333 requirement? 4.333.
That's pretty much what the certificate of completion or the certificate of attendance is, depending, and districts have the ability to call that what they want to call it. Some may call it a certificate of completion, some may call it a certificate of attendance, and that's pretty much what that is. It's just saying, in essence, the student did not meet the 4.333 threshold. They did, however, complete their transition needs according to the district. Kirsten, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. I think I've caught all the questions. I think what I heard you say again was the importance, if you don't agree, to go back to your IEP team. And then from there, if you don't feel like it's a resolution that you all agree with, then you can start the dispute resolution process, which we always encourage to start at the lowest level problem solving. It just, it doesn't solve anything to get, but at least to start the process so that you can, oh, I see Alicia put in there the dispute resolution. So folks, just go ahead and click on that and you'll see it on the Ask website. But to really start with your IEP team, so is really critical. It looks like Liz said, for me, a certificate is not a diploma. My child did more than show up. He did the work, he just has limitations. I would prefer a diploma for him. So I'll let you two speak to that because you were part of that journey.
And I would say, Liz, to that, although I don't know the school district or any of the specifics involved in that, if your district has what Kirsten talked about, the alternate pathways to a diploma for your student to meet the 433, even though it may not have been Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry, if your school district has the alternate pathway, they would still receive a diploma if that is an option through your school district. And as I said, I can't talk to specific school districts because there's just too many of them for either Kirsten and I to know all the ins and outs of every district in the state. So
you would say best practice would go back to their policies at their school and look at those. And Mari speaks to parents could talk to the school board why this is important, because the school board, again, they help guide those policies. So again, your circle of influence, education, better understanding, perceptions, perspective. So, yep, good point.
And I would
Mari.
say if you're concerned about what your school board has determined that path to look like, that's a question to ask when your student is in 7th or 8th grade, so that by the time they get to high school, if you have concerns, you can go to the school board and address those concerns. Maybe you can be, a person that can help change policy or get people to think differently if you don't agree with it. It doesn't mean that it will happen, but that's the place to start, is on the local level, because those decisions are made at that local level.
All right. Well, it looks like we captured most of the questions. There was the one about the concern about the district, and Kirsten, it sounds like you gave that person some options, and then they could also reach out to you also, is what I heard. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Come back next week. These two lovely ladies will join us again. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.